Hello, my name is Juliana Chavez, and I will be talking about embodied cognition for my teach back. So, in the sense of embodied cognition being mentioned in lecture and assigned readings, it was mentioned a couple times, but I will be focusing on two of them. So that's the embodied cognition, Boglia and Wilson, and the developing embodied cognition, Welpsy and Pexman. So the first one that I'll be going into is the embodied cognition paper, and it talks about traditional cognitive science and how it regarded the body to be peripheral to knowledge and cognition. Computationalism is used to argue that point, since the mind can still develop abstract ideas in cognition without having a body per se, and that would be the main argument for that. And whereas embodied cognition sees cognition in the body as a dynamical interplay between neural and non-neural processes. Hence the idea that the body can constrain, regulate, and shape natural mental activities. So embodied cognition, for that reason, strays away from traditional cognitive science. And going further into the differences, for traditional cognitive science argues that the body has feedback-driven role in mental functioning, so complex behaviors and adaptive success do not require any reference to computation and representation at all. And we don't need a mental image, since we're receiving immediate feedback. And this could be an example, for example, somebody that is blind and is using, they don't use a visual representation to continue on with successfully being able to move around. And so that is an example of where traditional cognitive science would help give further explanation for that. And the traditional ideas also think of the mind as an abstract beyond the body, which could entail the belief of spirits, gods, and non-physical entities that are able to be intellectual and to attain that knowledge without depending on the physical body to develop that knowledge and cognition. And traditional also could include the isolation of physical realization from internal central things, so, this idea of the black box almost. Furthermore, the classicalist would believe information conveyed by a mental representation has no modality-specific features. In the argument for the embodied cognition, it's important for the thesis to show that systems for sending, acting, and thinking are constitutively interdependent, and modality-specific representations are what our cognition is made of. And it's really dependent on gesturing influences to show further information and evidence about embodiment. And it shows how interpersonal communication, language processing, and also how gestures can serve as an interpersonal communication, language processing, and also how they can serve as feedback to change the gesture's thinking. For example, finger counting, or just using gesturing in your overall daily life when you're giving a lecture, when you are talking, it helps you mediate that information. And so finger counting helps for mathematical concepts, and that's also a very compelling argument that's used. And overall, an active and direct involvement of the body in the execution of a cognitive task simplifies its computational workload, which is a huge part of why the mind and the body can be influential to each other. In the sense of neurons, mirror neurons activate not only when we observe or understand action performed by others, but also when we carry out that same action within our body, especially if it falls within our behavior repertoire. So by way of performing a movement, we would not simply accomplish an action, but also accumulate the motor experiences necessary to represent the mind of others. And this is showing a little bit more of how the mirror neurons and just overall embodiment can give a bit of insight over social understanding and offloading things onto our written things, and just overall making cognition easier to digest. Non-neural parts of the body constitute the building blocks of conceptual knowledge, and that's just an argument that is made by the embodiment thesis. And there are two distinct but related roles that the body plays in cognition. The first stresses the idea that the body can function as a cognitive constraint, whereas the second role highlights the different ways in which the body acts as a distributor for cognitive processing. So that's mostly what we went into for the first reading, the embodied cognition one. The second one would be the developing embodied cognition, and that is the embodied cognition's theories that posts different degrees of embodiment and disembodiment. And disembodied end of the spectrum posts that sensory motor experience is in cognitive processing. So this supports the view that while sensory motor experiences might be important important for infants' earliest learning cognition, it becomes progressively more abstract and less embodied with development. And the embodiment account suggests that cognition is constituted in action and sensory-motor processing that are conceptual representations and that are dependent on sensory-motor experiences. So it emphasizes the importance of sensory-motor experiences gained through our bodily interaction with the environment and just the environment being able to give us representation of conceptual knowledge. And we also go over the secondary embodiment theory, which proposes that the sensory-motor areas of the brain are activated as a byproduct of cognitive processing. So from this perspective, sensory-motor activation during cognitive processing is a passive consequence of and less of a necessity for representing a concept. The other we went through was the weak embodiment account, which is we need sensory-motor experience initially, but it's no longer as important later on. And I feel like this becomes a little easier to argue as, you know, a more abstract. I feel like embodied cognition is definitely used more for more concrete concepts and less for abstract concepts. Like, you know, we can use them for finger counting, but it's a little bit harder to justify that when we're going deeper into mathematics. And I'll go further into that later on. And so the article talks about sensory-motor experience that typically involve an action being performed and observers of the one learning that. So they argue that sensory-motor interactions with the environment continue to be important for language processing and increased conceptual understanding. And this is primarily shown by the data of the infants with higher scores on motor exploration variables at the ages 5 months that had higher scores on intellectual and academic measures because of that. And the functional knowledge gained through interactions objects can determine how objects and categories are formed, and just primarily showing more about the embodiment part and spectrum of our cognition and knowledge and just how that could actually impact it. So when I went through both lectures, but I want to go deeper into what embodied cognition can mean in different spectrums and different, I guess, fields. And one that I will be going into is mathematics. So the manipulative imagination, how to move things around in mathematics by Valeria Girardino. And so it goes through it says that core knowledge, representation, and cognition are modal data structures that get processed independently of the brain's modal systems. And it's devoted to perception, action, and introspection. So it argues that a flaw of cognitive embodied cognition is that they see perception, action, and even introspection to be a part of our cognitive processes, which is a bit where, you know, there's a separation between the mind and consciousness, you could argue. And they propose the idea that there are views in view representations in mathematics or visual representations in mathematics that are cognitive tools, and that a moderate approach to embodied cognition may be more beneficial and more easy to argue in a sense. So cognition can be considered in part embodied because it's information obtained from prior perception, the awareness of the relative position of one's own body part, and the kinesthesis, which is the ability to feel movements of the limbs and body. It happens to be used for other more abstract tasks as well. The idea is that the brain redeploys cognitive processes having different use at their origin to solve new tasks and new concepts. They propose to distinguish the conceptual reading and semiotic reading. So they separate those, and those are just two ways to consider mathematics as embodied. In the conceptual reading mathematical notions, they are conceptualized by means of grounding metaphors that are based on bodily experience. And the semiotic reusing mathematics makes use of signs that are to be perceived and acted upon, which incorporate sensory-motor consideration. And this paper mostly focuses on the second, primarily because argues that the first is less applicable because cognitive science theory should be about mathematics as a whole and not necessarily just elementary mathematics. And this is directly criticizing the idea that yes, counting with our fingers as children may influence cognition, which would then help paint mathematics as embodied. But the real issue is that as math becomes more complex, that argument is not as applicable. It's harder to really give that as evidence for mathematics as a whole and embedding that with cognition as a whole as well in cognitive science theory. So since signs are not simple objects, instead objects that are used to refer to something else in this case, is some algebraic relationships that fact that they become such targets may have an influence on our capacity to access their meaning. So they also introduced the fact that, you know, if students were to be trained in recognizing algebraic expressions by using stand perceptual learning techniques, that may lead to lasting gains in equation reading and comprehension. And they introduced the fact that there's a possible role for perception and action, which would be the knot diagram. So I showed the knot diagram on my presentation there, and it's used as an illustration, a visual illustration, but it's also a dynamical tool for mathematics. And when looking at them, experts learn to perceive their possible moves, and they're able to make inferences about the properties of the knot. It is noted when using the topological knot if it could argue its use of moderate embodied approach to cognition, because some kind of bodily experience seems to be redeployed when relating to more abstract tasks like the knot. And these actions seem to be redeployed when relating to more to the context of mathematics because they become epistemic, which implies that they may lead to new inferences and some mathematical properties of the topological knot. And it's valuable to note that the physical features of the knot diagrams are useful and effective because they trigger manipulative imagination in such a way that enhances reasoning and inferences. So it concludes the specific actions on cognitive tools happen to be crucial to mathematical reasoning, and cognitive tools trigger these actions by referring to offering representational affordance. But these actual representational affordance themselves are just a trigger, not necessarily they're a cognitive tool that is triggered and not necessarily just the themselves cognition. And these actions conform to some constraints, but by moving things around, we actually perform on material science and therefore meaningful operations, which then directly enhance mathematical reasoning. So this paper, I feel, does not necessarily go completely towards embodied cognition as a holistic view. It just takes discrete parts of it and tries to implement mathematics as a whole, and then, you know, an actual cognitive science theory as a whole for embodied cognition, which I feel was really good for challenging embodied cognition's flaws as well. And the second one that I will be mentioning is the embodied cognition communications studies with the British fine woodworks by Trevor H. Marchand. And this argues that cognitive operations that make possible both the enactment and the understanding of practice are what we receive somatic information, and that's interpreted from the body. And physical practice communicates, and therefore, like language, its components are motor domains of cognition. So the compositional nature of mental representation underlies the ongoing and novel production of knowledge, and representations generated in the motor domain of cognition from this constitute basis of motor-based knowledge that makes possible interpretation, understanding, and realization of practice. So motor cognition needs to be open to information processed by visual cognition. So this directly makes a tie between motor cognition and visual cognition to show that it's essential for learning these type of this. For example, woodwork. It's essential to have this visual representation and an actual physical connection with what we're doing. You know, not just the mind, but the body is influencing the mind by this visual cognition and this motor cognition. And he also focuses on the idea that the body can be imagined in a way that can improve knowledge. For example, a dancer may use their body as a mental representation to feel or manipulate their body as they please, which then enhances their understanding of what the dance should look like and the dance as a whole, right? And so visual imagery of the bodily movement serves as input to our motor domains, where it's parsed into components of posture, gestures, and actions. And they are then mapped incrementally to motor representations, and interpretation from the body is constructed. And that practical skill develops in bodily practice through repetition and rehearsal and simulated motor imagery of the exercise. So this gives us context that is individually possessed at the set of mind internal representations, and that we create a kinesthetic and proceptive interpretation of actions, gestures, and postures that may be important to learning things like woodwork. So this shows that, learning and being a part of something like woodwork, right, is very essential to have or consider embodied cognition, just primarily because the body and its visual representations and its gestures and all that are something that you can't necessarily have internally. They're very much external. So it just makes this connection between the two. And I feel like it agrees a little bit more with embodied cognition than the mathematical ones. But nonetheless, they were both very helpful in understanding more about and just challenging why embodied cognition is important to cognitive science as a whole, right? So the third, the last one that I did was music and the muscle, how embodied cognition may influence music preference. So real or imagined body movements during music listening can, based on this article, can co-determine music preferences. And they also have an important role in development of music preferences. So usually music and body movements are intimately connected, and it's shown that the body movements can focus our attention on specific aspects of music, like rhythm, for example. And the underlying idea is that cognition relies heavily on bodily states or the brain's modality specific systems, right? And we mentioned this a little bit in the embodied cognition lecture. And embodiments become established in the memory as part of representations of familiar situations. They argue that the body movement has more positive effects on emotional states than when listening to music. And there's also evidence that body movements or musical narration can systematically induce positive as well as negative attitudes towards objects, and it's then arguably modifies preferences and preference judgment in general. So the effect of the body's movements on attitudes is established by the mechanism that induces changes in attitude. However, that's still unclear as to what causes the change, but the actual connection between movement and attitude is very much established. So they tested this by having participants do 3 kinds of body movements, which fit in either negative or positive motor behaviors. And the data suggests that there's a general impact of body movements on musical preference judgment, but they do acknowledge that there isn't quite enough to conclude anything about underlying mechanisms. But it is noticed that the positive body movements yielded consistently higher preference ratings for concurrently playing music. So they could conclude that embodied cognition may play a role in music preference, and they also say that the relationship may be unclear to some extent, but that breaking down this relationship with experiments like this could help define the relationship between body movements and music preference, or maybe other topics with similar dynamics. So now on the effect of the field of cognitive science. So how does this affect cognitive science? So how does it provide insight on the human mind? So embodied cognition provides insight on how the human mind may retain information and knowledge, and it reflects on that. It also challenges external factors and its relevance on the mind. So how the body and the mind can actually, be paralleled or even connected, and if they have a dynamic in that sense. And it questions how much our cognition and knowledge is actually connected and influenced by the body. And so it really does challenge traditional cognitive science, which nonetheless will give us more insight on the human mind, because even if it may be wrong at some points or not applicable at some points, it still gives us valuable information on how to tackle the human mind. And as for the subfields, it draws upon psychology and education mostly, I think, and just because as the paper I mentioned, like a couple papers I mentioned, constantly directed a parallel between embodied cognition and its relevance to enhancing memory and just overall our ability to retain knowledge and making cognition more digestible. So it shows how and knowing more about embodied cognition could directly impact how we tackle learning and how we tackle education. And so also in social and cognitive psychology and just understanding the different dynamics between the environment and the body and just the other mind and bodies that surround us. And For the how I might create a new study to investigate embodied cognition, I would do a study with three groups of people, in the sense that they all three get different instructions to building a box. One would be a list of instructions, so more not verbal, but they would just be written, and they could read them twice. And then to the second group would get a visual example, so maybe someone actually constructing the box, and that would be twice as well. And then there'd be the third one, which would be a combination of verbal and visual components of the instructions, just to show how maybe those dynamics could further either improve or serve as a disadvantage for the person constructing that box. So this way we could see, how each way or each form of instruction may produce different outcomes. Overall, the study would be rather practical. It would just show us more about embodied cognition and our need for our dependence on visual representation, for our knowledge and just memory, and just how we also can use our body to retain more insight on memory that we have previously done. So it would just give us insight on which is the best for learning. And of course, it would just be a demonstration of that, but it could lead to larger understanding of it. So yeah, that's mostly it. Thank you so much